Well, I bring you greetings from Las Vegas. Now, Las Vegas is just like anywhere else, except for when it isn't. I can remember when my kids were little, we pulled up to a stop sign. We're riding along in our minivan, and my wife and I are in the front seats. My son and daughter in the back. I think my son was about 7 at the time, and his sister would have been maybe a year or two older. And we're sitting there, and we pull up to this stop sign. There's a billboard, and it's the back sides of 5 women, and they're in bikini bottoms, and they're standing there, and it says the hits are back on the billboard. And I remember my son Ethan turns to his sister, and just as innocently as he could possibly say it, he goes, "Emma, which naked girls are your favorite? I like the one with brown hair." All the air sucked out of our minivan, and my wife Lori and I had a moment of like, what have we done moving our family to Las Vegas? But we're so glad that we did because we love people. We love broken people. We love together people. We love business people. We love down and out people. We love messy people. We love clean people. We love all kinds of people. And we've seen God do some incredible things, not only in our lives, but in the lives of others as we love others. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, being a friend of people that may be considered on the outside, maybe considered by some of the religious community as those who are kind of washed up or moved past, and loving people where they are, because God can work so powerfully in that, not only in their life, but in our life. I'm so glad that I was a recipient of that kind of love in my own life. I mean, I grew up in the church community in a little town, Amarillo, Texas. And my parents would go to church, and they would go in. I remember as I started to grow up a little bit, I would tell them I was going to the youth group, and then I would walk through the church building and walk out and roam the residential area around the church while service was going on, and then meet them back at the car. My parents would say, "How was church?" I'd say, "It was awesome." They'd say, "What'd you learn about?" I'd say, "We learned about Jesus." And they're like, okay, that was always good enough for my mom. But then I remember later, like when my son's growing up, and I remember he came home from church one day. I said, "Ethan, how was church?" He said, "It was great." I said, "What'd you learn about?" He says, "I learned about Jesus." I'm like, "Get over here and sit down. That is not going to work in this house. We're gonna talk about this." But I would tell my mom, "Hey, I just learned about Jesus," and that was good enough for her, and we kind of moved along. I never really understood church. I didn't understand why people went to church. I wasn't a person of faith in my own life and couldn't really comprehend. I remember just standing there watching people walk across the parking lot and go in the church and not really getting it. Well, I got caught up in about a 4-year drug addiction in my life that started when I was about 13 years old, started running around with kids that were a lot older than me, and got into all kinds of trouble and issues in my life. And I can remember coming to this place as this addiction grew and grew and grew in my life. And I got to this crossroads. Some of you have been there. I got to this place where I knew I was either going to go crazy or I was going to die. I was going to go to jail, or I was going to get help. And really, when it comes to addiction, as it begins to grow in somebody's life, those are about the 4 final options. You're either going to go crazy eventually, you're going to get some help, you're going to die, or you're going to go to jail. And that's exactly where I was. And so I wasn't sure that I believed in God the way the Christian people believed in God, or the way my parents believed in God. I wasn't sure that I was going to find answers in the church community, but I knew I couldn't beat this addiction on my own. And so I can still remember the Sunday morning. I was standing in the parking lot watching the latecomers walk into church, and I walked in through the doors of that church for the first time on my own terms. And I was seeking, and I was asking questions, and I found my way to this little group of people, this little Bible study. This group of people, they loved me, they walked with me, they coached me, they became my healing community. They didn't even know it, but they became my 12-step support group, basically. And God used these people powerfully to save my life. In fact, after that experience, I've just pretty much gone from there and dedicated my entire life to helping other people have the similar kind of experience where they find the grace and the hope and the love of God in Jesus Christ through the local church. I love the church. I'm so thankful for the church. God used the church to save my life, and God can use you to save the lives of others around you. So every day, I have it in my pocket today, every day as I'm getting ready to leave the house, I grab my recovery chip. This one says 28 years of sobriety. Celebrate recovery. And I grabbed this not because I'm chained to the past or, it was a long time ago in my life, but I grab it every day and I put it in my pocket before I head out. And I carry it because it's a reminder to me of all God has done in my life. It's a reminder to me of His grace. It reminds me that if God did this in my life, God can do this in somebody else's life. It reminds me that if God was patient and merciful with me, God will be patient and merciful with others. It reminds me when I get frustrated with people who don't seem to be changing, how patient God was with me when I didn't change. And so I carry this chip to remind myself that I've been rescued by God to be a rescuer. And friends, I want to encourage you today because you've been rescued to be a rescuer. We're going to be looking at the book of Matthew today, chapter 9. You've been in this incredible series on the life and teaching of Jesus. And so we're going to be in Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 9. And we're just going to take this opportunity to lean in a little bit and learn and listen as Jesus calls Matthew, the author of the book, to follow him in life. So check this out, Matthew chapter 9. Let's pick it up in verse 9, and let's look at the call of Matthew. It says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. Follow me and be my disciple, Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Now, there's a lot here. First of all, Jesus is walking along. He sees Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. Now, tax collectors were one of the most hated groups of people in the ancient world. I mean, especially in this part of the Jewish world. They absolutely despised them because tax collectors were seen as basically traitors to the Roman occupiers. They would collect taxes. These were kind of like import duties. They had a lot of freedom in how much or how little they taxed other people. And so these tax collectors, they could tax you on where you parked your boat. They could tax you on how many fish you caught. They could tax you on your animals, your donkey, whatever. And so they had a lot of latitude. They're backed by the Roman military army. And the people despised them and hated them. In fact, some of the tax collectors would basically give the rich a break on their taxes, and then they would overtax the middle class or the lower class to make up for the gap, and then they would get kickbacks from the rich personally. So there's all kinds of corruption, all kinds of stuff going on. Matthew is a tax collector. Now, Alfred Edersheim, who's a Jewish scholar of that era and time, says that basically Jewish tax collectors were not allowed in the synagogue. They were not allowed to gather with other religious Jews. They were seen as unclean. They were put in the same category as murderers and robbers. They were not able to give public testimony in a Jewish court. So these people were the lowest of the low. I mean, they were hated and despised. And so one of the things we often miss here is that Jesus walks up to Matthew and addresses him as he's a religious leader. I mean, religious leaders didn't do that. Religious leaders did not address tax collectors. They didn't want anything to do with a tax collector because they were the lowest of the low. And yet Jesus sees past what Matthew has done. He sees past how Matthew is perceived. He sees past whatever scandalous thing has gone on in his life, and instead he sees the potential of what God can do. And so he comes up to Matthew, no hesitation, and he says, "Come follow me." So good. And listen, in your own life, I think it's easy to think, I've made mistakes, I've failed, God won't invite me into a journey with him because of my failures, my mistakes. But I want you to know, it doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter what you've been through. Listen, God is not so scandalized by whatever you may have done that he won't invite you on a journey with him. And I think Jesus today still says, come and follow me. So Matthew starts this spiritual journey. He begins to follow God in his heart and in his life. He begins to go on this spiritual journey, and at great cost to himself, which is awesome. Matthew learns he's been rescued to be a rescuer. And friends, I believe we've all been rescued to be a rescuer. How do we do that? How are we rescued to be a rescuer? Well, here's a few principles. One is to be a friend to outsiders. Be a friend to outsiders. I can remember walking with a friend of mine a while back, and we were in a shopping area in the Las Vegas area walking along, and he did something I've never seen anybody do before or since. As we're just sort of walking along, hanging out, all of a sudden, mid-word, I'm actually looking at his face, he's talking, he just threw up. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, he completely, like mid-word, just let it go. And so we're walking along, this happens, and I'm kind of in shock. I don't know what to do. So we just keep walking, right? Because what do you do in that moment? I'm like, we just keep walking. So, you okay? He's like, yeah, I think I feel a little better. I'm like, man, I didn't know you weren't feeling good anyway. So we keep walking along. We're maybe 15 steps moving along, and then I'm like, well, there's a restroom back the other way. You want to turn around and go back the other way? He goes, yeah, we better do that. And so we turn around and we start walking the other way. And as soon as we are walking the other way, we're in the flow of people going back towards the scene of the crime, basically. And in this moment, before I could do anything, I look up, and here's this woman. She's walked into his mess. Both feet go flying up, and she goes right down on her backside. It was as bad as you think it was. Awful. And I was, and it just happened so fast, right? She hits the ground. Her friends come over. They begin to help her stand up. And I'll never forget this moment. She looks up and she says, "What's this?" I'm like, "Oh, you do not want to know what that is." Now, I would have helped the lady up, but we had a couple things going on. One, her friends were right there. They were already helping her up by the time we got up there. And two, my friend was about to go again. He was like a ticking time bomb. In fact, we walked a few more feet, going the other direction. He threw up again and again and again as I was trying to get this guy to the restroom. It was crazy. But I tell you that story because it's a lot like life. Life is messy. Sometimes it's the mess we create. Sometimes it's the mess somebody else creates. Sometimes we're just walking along, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves in this situation, both feet up, right on our back in the middle of a mess. And we say, "What's this? What's going on?" And friends, it's easy to look at somebody in the middle of the mess and only see the mess, not the masterpiece that God has created in that human being. And so, friends, I want to encourage you to look past the mess in other people's lives. Life is messy. Church is messy. Things are messy. This is just life. But God has created masterpieces, even if they're messy, when He's created human beings. And we can look at any person and realize that they are created in the image of God, that they're loved by God, and they should be loved by me. And so no matter how messy it is, no matter what the situation is, look past the mess and see the potential. That's what Jesus does with Matthew, and that's what Jesus even does with Matthew's friends. Check this out. Matthew chapter 9. Let's look at the very next verse, beginning in verse 10. Matthew chapter 9, verse 10. It says, "Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with such scum?' When Jesus heard this, he said, 'Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do.'" So here we are. Jesus is at a dinner party, basically with the friends of Matthew, and they're hanging out. And the religious leaders, man, they don't like this. They're bothered by this. In fact, one of the things that's interesting in that culture, to eat with somebody was a huge deal. I mean, to have a meal with somebody was really to show a gesture of friendship and companionship and loyalty. They lived in a culture where who you ate with said everything about kind of who you were. So they're very particular about who they ate with, who they didn't eat with. Even today, if you know an Orthodox Jewish individual, man, if they invite you into their home, that is a huge deal. If they will sit down and eat with you, break bread with you, that's still today, it's an extension of friendship and companionship and kindness. And so that was very true in Jesus' culture. And this would have been a small Jewish town where gossip would have spread, conversation would have spread. So probably the Pharisees weren't at the actual dinner because they wouldn't have anything to do with all these people, these notorious sinners. But Jesus was there, and they hear about it. And so later they go to the disciples, and they're like, "Hey, why does he eat with such scum?" which, gosh, here's the religious leaders, the very people that are supposed to represent the heart of God, and yet they become so cold and so hard-hearted towards these other individuals. They call them scum, just flat out, like dirt, scum, horrible people. Why would you eat with these people? And it's easy to be hard on the Pharisees. It's easy to look at the Pharisees and think, gosh, why don't you guys get it? If you look through the teaching of Jesus, sometimes he has some of his harshest criticisms for the Pharisees and for the religious leaders. And yet, Jesus was also most like the Pharisees. I mean, he followed the law. He understood the Bible. He gave the Pharisees, sent out missionaries. In a lot of ways, Christians today are very much like Pharisees if we believe the Bible, if we're trying to send out missionaries, if we're giving financially, if we're sacrificing, if we're trying to follow the commandments of God, if we're devoted people. See, to be a Pharisee in the ancient world was a compliment. That was a huge honor. If you were a Pharisee, that was a big deal. And today we kind of lose that. So it's easy for us to be hard on the Pharisees, but yet sometimes if we're not careful, we can become a Pharisee in our own heart and in our own life. It was Nietzsche who said, beware lest in fighting the dragon, you become the dragon. And I think that's what we see in the lives and hearts of some of these religious leaders. They had lost perspective that God still loves people overall, and that in the midst of all these things that they disapproved of, they had kind of missed the fact and lost the fact that God could still work and move in their lives. So Matthew throws a party, brings all his friends. Here's all these people that are notorious sinners. Jesus comes and hangs out with them. And Luke chapter 15, the religious leaders get so upset that Jesus keeps doing this stuff that they say, look, he actually welcomes sinners and eats with them. And that word welcomes is fascinating to me because the word that Jesus welcomes sinners, it could be translated takes pleasure in them, even takes delight in them. In other words, Jesus isn't just tolerating these sinners and individuals coming together at a dinner party. Jesus actually enjoys being around them. He's enjoying hanging out with them. Now, he could be around people and not approve of everything they did. He could be friends with people and not approve of everything they did. And yet, God used him so powerfully in these relational moments, and he modeled for us what it means to be a friend to outsiders. Be friendly to people who are on the outside. We need this message so strongly in the church today. I had a friend went through a terrible divorce in his life, and he wasn't unfaithful in the situation, but there was unfaithfulness that was involved, and it was really hard on him and on their family. And he went to his church, and his church basically said, you need to go reconcile with your wife, and when you reconcile with your wife, then you're welcome back into the church. Now he didn't even do anything wrong. He's like, okay, so I have to go work all this out, and then I'm able to come and be a part of the church community. And I remember talking to him, and he's like, Jud, I just don't understand that. I need the church now. I need their help now, and yet now I feel like I'm all alone trying to get back on my feet. I'll never forget the lady at our church who was leaving, and I saw her in the lobby. She's walking out, and she said, you know what? I'm not coming back anymore. I said, well, why is that? What's wrong? She said, well, I'm not sure anymore with all these people that are coming. I don't want to sit in the seats that they may have been seated in. I'm not sure what I might catch. And I remember sitting there just thinking, wow, I think Jesus is more offended at your heart and attitude right now than he would be at whatever those people are doing. And it's John Ortberg who talked about the historic Christian distinction that theologians have made down through the years when it comes to sin. Some theologians have talked about both sins of the spirit and sins of the flesh. It's a way that they categorize different sins. And I think it's important here because sometimes we look at even a place like Las Vegas and we see the sins of the flesh. That's what we see. We see sexual sins. We see sins related to gambling or addiction or whatever. And we focus in on the sins of the flesh. And the sins of the flesh kind of blind us to everything else. But theologians also have another category of sin. That is the sins of the spirit. Pride, arrogance, self-righteousness. It's interesting when you look at the ministry of Jesus, he seems to be way more indignant and angry and upset about the sins of the spirit than necessarily the sins of the flesh. Not that they aren't significant and serious, But his primary anger towards the religious leaders and towards people of faith was that they were blinded by their own pride and arrogance to see what God could do in the life of another person. And so, friends, today I just want to encourage you. Be a friend to those who maybe are on the outside. Yeah, maybe they're caught up in some things right now. Maybe it's a mess. Maybe you don't even see a way out for them. But what they often need in their life isn't advice. It isn't condemnation. It isn't judgment. What they often just need is a friend, somebody willing to listen and walk with them. And when they're open, when they're ready, you'll be the friend that they turn to. You know, I've seen that in my own life. I always try to have somebody in my life that I'm praying for that I would consider to be far from God. Maybe they've just drifted from Him in their lives, or maybe they've never really engaged faith in their lives. And I pray for that person on a daily basis. I'm just asking God to give me that opportunity. And I want to encourage you to do that. And if you don't know anybody like that, then pray that God would bring somebody in your life like that. He can do some amazing things. Like I can remember praying for my neighbor, and I was just specifically asking God to give me an opportunity to share my faith with my neighbor. I just wanted that moment to be able to talk with my neighbor about God. And she wasn't necessarily very open to it. So I was trying to be patient and just sort of journey it out. And I'll never forget, I started praying every day earnestly, God, give me an opportunity to share my faith with my neighbor. And I ran home, middle of the day. I was just stopping by the house to pick something up. And I pulled in, and I was grabbing my trash can out at the corner of our driveway. And I was pulling it up the driveway. And my neighbor comes running over to me, and she says, hey, she says, do you baptize people? Just out of the blue. That's the first thing she says to me. Jud, do you baptize people? I'm like, yeah. I mean, I'm a pastor. Yeah, that's what I do. And she says, well, do you think, we could talk about my baptism? And I remember just standing there going like, you have not been open to a spiritual conversation. I start praying every day that God would give me an opportunity to share my faith and story more clearly with you. And then you just walk up to me when I'm taking the trash in from the corner and want to talk about baptism. God's amazing, and God will surprise you, and He will show up in your life and work when you begin to pray for others. So my encouragement is realize you've been rescued to be a rescuer. So ask God every day for an opportunity just to share what He's done in your heart and in your life. Here's another principle to help us remember to be rescuers in our life, and that is to simply remember your rescue. Remember your rescue. See, it's so easy for us to be like the religious leaders. It's so easy for us to come to faith and start on that journey and then forget all that God has done in our hearts and in our lives. I had a buddy of mine years ago. I remember when he first walked into church, he looked like he actually had walked right out of a Las Vegas nightclub. I mean, he had this silk shirt on, all kind of buttoned down. He had the gold and the whole deal. He was actually a bodyguard or a bouncer at a strip club in the Las Vegas area. And so he comes rocking up on Sunday morning, kind of been up all night, Saturday night, doing the nightclub kind of thing. And I remember like meeting him as he walked into church, and this guy was raw, so incredibly raw. And over the years, I invited him into our home. He became part of our group. We studied together. We learned together. Over the years, we really helped him. I mean, he came to faith. He was baptized. He became a follower of Jesus. God began to do a work in his life. His whole outlook changed. The chip on his shoulder changed. Everything changed. It was awesome. But I'll never forget, like, somewhere in that 3 to 5 year range, and this is what I see with a lot of people who become followers of Jesus, somewhere in the 3 to 5 year range of their spiritual journey, God has cleaned them up. God has helped restore them in their life. They're forgiven. They're free. They've let go of a lot of the destructive things that they were doing, and they're on solid ground now. But if they're not careful, they start to get so far away from who they were that they start to judge everybody else around them, and they forget how far God has brought them. So I'm standing out in the church lobby after services one weekend, and there's my buddy. I can tell he's angry, like his face is red, and this is a tough guy anyway. He used to be a boxer before he was a bouncer, and I go up to him. I'm like, hey man, what's going on? He says, I'm about to take this guy outside, and I'm about to teach him a lesson. I remember just like, what? He goes, yeah, this guy. He goes, I said, whoa, back up. What happened? What's going on? He said, this guy, goes, I don't know him. He just walked past me in church wearing a Budweiser t-shirt. And he said, he is disrespecting my God and disrespecting God's house by wearing that T-shirt in this house. I'm going to take him out to the parking lot and teach him a lesson. I remember standing there for a minute. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. I put my arm on this friend of mine's shoulder. I looked him right in the eye, and I said, let me tell you something. Do you remember where you were a few years ago when you walked in here and you smelled like a strip club? Do you remember when your shirt was unbuttoned down to your belly button and you had gold chains on and you were all that and you had a chip on your shoulder and you were angry and you were depressed and you were sad and every other word was fallacious? Do you remember who you were when you walked in here and nobody judged you and nobody condemned you? We loved you. We walked with you. We helped you. And now you're going to tell me that you want to take a guy outside and beat him down because he has a Budweiser T-shirt on? I'm like, look, I don't care what he's got on. I'm glad he's here. And where else should that guy be on a Sunday morning than in church? That's awesome. My friend looked at me for a minute. He paused, and then he looked down at the ground, and he said, that's why I love you, Pastor. You always give it to me straight. You're right, you're right, you're right. But look, the most dangerous believer is the believer who has forgotten all that God has done in their life and become arrogant, self-righteous, and judgmental. The most dangerous believer is the believer who has forgotten all that God has done in their life, and they have become arrogant, self-righteous, and judgmental. And friends, that's what we see in the religious leaders here. So look at what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 13, says this. Then he added, he already said healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. He says, then he added, now go and learn the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. He quotes Hosea. I won't go into all of it, but Hosea is a pretty remarkable Old Testament book about the crazy, irrational, illogical love of God for his people. And Hosea is really the first place that the marriage metaphor really gets blown out in the Bible of God's relationship to his people being likened to that of a husband and a wife, of a marriage kind of relationship. Hosea is the first place in the Old Testament where that really gets blown out. And so he kind of does a throwback to Hosea for these religious leaders. And he says, look, learn the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. Look, don't lose in all of your religious sacrifice. And the Pharisees were really good at sacrificing, at creating rules within rules within rules to make sure that they don't break the other rule. They were really good at that side of things. He's like, I want you to show mercy. Don't lose mercy in the midst of this. In fact, when you look at the life and teaching of Jesus, one of the things that's fascinating to me is if you look at the emotional life of Jesus, the one human emotion the Bible says he showed more than any other is compassion. If you just look at the number of human emotions that are laid out in the life and teaching of Jesus, and if you look at how often they're mentioned, compassion is mentioned more than anything else. He was moved with compassion. His heart was moved with compassion again and again. He showed mercy to people who were hurting and struggling. Friends, in your life, in your heart, don't lose sight of all that God has done. He restored you. He redeemed you. He saved you. Christ died for you and rose again for you. And you may or may not have had a rocky past, but don't lose sight at what God did in your life, and don't ever forget what he can do in someone else's life. Remember your rescue. Remember all that God has done. In fact, I went through the New Testament and just wrote down all of the things that the New Testament says that you are. This is who the Bible says you are as a believer and follower of Jesus. And so it says you are Jesus' followers. You are Jesus' friends. You are children of God. You are children of light. You are members of God's family. You are holy and blameless, standing before God without a single fault. You are God's people. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You are the branches that bear fruit. You are God's field. You are God's building. You are living stones in God's temple. You are holy priests. You are a holy nation. You are a chosen people. You are God's workers. You're Christ's ambassadors. You're true ministers of God united with Christ. You are a part of his body living by the Spirit. You are God's masterpiece. You are the faithful ones meant for better things. You are receiving a kingdom that is unshakable. You are looking forward to a home that is yet to come. You are heirs of God's glory. You are set free from the slavery of sin. You are truly free. That's who the Bible says you are. That's God's rescue. That's God's rescue in your heart and in your life. You're rescued to be a rescuer. So be a friend to outsiders. Remember God's rescue and then represent God's rescue in your own life. You know, here's some lyrics to a popular song from a few years ago. It goes like this. I stay out too late. Got nothing in my brain. That's what people say. That's what people say. I go on too many dates, but I can't make them stay. At least that's what people say. That's what people say. Because the player's going to play, and the hater's going to hate. Baby, I'm just going to shake it off. Shake it off. Listen, the world is filled with players and fakers and heartbreakers and haters. And sometimes those attitudes and perspectives can get us off focus of our mission. But we have a mission, and it's the same mission that Jesus had in his heart and in his life. We got to shake all that off and represent the rescue of God. Look at what Jesus says next. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. Matthew 9:13, he says, "For I have come to call not those who think they are righteous," maybe a little dig there, "not those who think they are righteous," to the religious leaders, "but those who know they are sinners." Those who know they are sinners. It's not the healthy, he says, that need a doctor. It's the sick. That's why we're here. We're on a mission to help other people experience the goodness and the love of God. You know, I was reminded a while back of just how important it is that we stay on this mission. How important it is that we remember that we've been rescued to be rescuers. It was when my father was in the hospital, and I got that phone call, you need to come back to Texas. Your dad's not doing well. And so I remember we got there. We got back to Texas. We went in to see him. My dad was, at the time, in his late 80s. He's an old World War II vet, master sergeant in the Army, was an elder in his church, incredible man, incredible godly man. And we had that moment. Some of you have had this with loved ones and with your parents, where the doctor comes in and he says, you better go say your goodbyes. And he's not responsive, so I'm not sure, you're going to hear anything back, but you just need to communicate your goodbyes. And so I go into his hospital room, and, what do you say, right? What do you say in that moment? So I got down on my knees beside the bed, and I grabbed his hand, and I remember just thanking him, frankly. I just thanked him for loving me through my years of addiction. I thanked him for always being kind to me when I didn't deserve it. I thanked him for praying for me when he wasn't sure where I was emotionally or spiritually, or if I was ever going to come home to God again. I thanked him for being a friend to me, a sinner, and really for being my greatest role model. I poured my heart out to him, and I didn't think he would even hear me. And all of a sudden, I look up, and my dad opened his eyes. And he smiled real big, and he said, "You're good kids, and I love you." He said, "I'm going for a walk in the sunshine, and I'll see you on the other side." It was the last thing my dad ever said to me. A few days later, he passed away in hospice. But I walked out of that hospital room, and it felt like the world tilted. I think for me, it was just a realization that life is short and it's precious. And all that really matters in life is your love for God and your love for other people, and helping other people come to know the love of God in their heart and in their life. Those are that's what lasts. That's what matters. When my dad was on his deathbed, he wasn't, interested in fame. It really wasn't about his hobbies. It really wasn't about his possessions. At that moment, it was all about his love for God and his love for people around him. And many of us around his hospital bed had been led to faith by him and his model and example. God can use you in a powerful way if you'll just allow him to. He can work in your life in a powerful way if you'll open your heart to him. You've been rescued to be a rescuer. So friends, remember your rescue. Don't lose sight of it. The most dangerous believer is the believer who's forgotten all that God has done in their life and they've become arrogant and proud and self-righteous. Be a friend to outsiders. Love people. Look, you can love people without agreeing with everything they do in their life. You can be kind to people without necessarily lining up with everything they believe in their life. Realize that, yeah, everybody's messy, but God can clean all of us up in His way, in His time. And so let's love. Jesus said the most important thing is that we love God and we love others. Let's love and let's love well. And let's remember, we've been rescued to be rescuers. Will you bow and pray with me? God, we're grateful for your love. We're grateful for the incredible opportunity that we have every day to represent you and all that you've done in our hearts and in our lives. God, I pray that you will continue to work through each and every one of us. Use our story and our brokenness and our hurt and our pain, and use it to bring encouragement and hope and light and love to others. God, I thank you for this great church and for these incredible people. Thank you for the awesome work that they do, and I pray you'll bless it in every way. Put your hand on it and show up powerfully in this coming season. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.